Thank you, Jenny, and thank you for that really significant work that you're doing on those art archives. Hi, I'm Terryl Givens. I wrote a book, Agency, in the Doctrine and Covenants series. So let me start by just, saying a few words about why I wrote the book on agency. Spencer Flubin, who conceived the project some years ago, invited me to participate and asked me what topic I would like to write on if I had my choice. And I chose agency. And let me just give you two reasons for my particular interest in the topic of agency. One has to do with a personal hobby of mine, which is I'm trying to reconstitute as I can the library of Joseph Smith. And I do this by going online and looking for the editions of the volumes that we know he donated to the Nauvoo Library. And one of those volumes is a book on freedom of the will. And it is a response, it's complicated, it's a response to an essay by Jonathan Edwards on whether or not the will is free. And don't know if Joseph Smith read this, but I expect he probably did because of how central free will agency was to his theological constituting of the Latter-day Saint tradition. And I'll say a bit more about that. The second reason why this topic appealed to me is because I happen to also be working on another project in the background, which is a modest, small project of writing a history of Christianity. Can I talk about that instead? I have to keep to the script. Early on in the project, as I was reading different kind of generalist and intellectual historical takes on early Christianity, the question that often comes up is how do you account for the phenomenal growth of early Christianity, which Rodney Stark says is only paralleled in the modern world by Mormonism's rapid growth in the 19th century. But the answer that many of these scholars give, one in particular, Elaine Pagels, great translator of the Nag Hammadi Library, and early historian of Christianity, and she said it was because of the idea of freedom. If you think about how highly stratified Roman society was, how bound people were by various kinds of marginalized status and conceptions of astral determinism and other philosophical schools, all of which emphasize a kind of stasis, a kind of limitation to human potential. And she said, this man called Jesus comes along and teaches that the soul is free and that by finding the truth, we can be free in every way that is meaningful. She said this idea just caught hold and fired the imagination of these Christians and appealed to them in a way that no other idea had. So I wanted to do a little bit of work for this series on the place of agency in Latter-day Saint thought and some of its precursor treatments in early Christianity. And it turns out that I don't think there is any idea or doctrine that turned out to be as important and as perpetually divisive within Christian thought as ideas about the freedom of the will. So for the first 3 to 4 centuries of Christian thought, it was uncontroversial. It was just a given. We are free. God made us free. Moral responsibility requires freedom. We get to a dramatic turning point in the late 4th, early 5th century with my favorite hero, Augustine. And some of you got that inside joke. And Augustine just thinks there's no way out from reading Paul in the way that he reads Paul, which seems to leave no room for human freedom and imputes to God absolute control and determinism over human nature. And so one of the great divisions in the early church that is resolved in Augustine's favor in the early 5th, and then again reaffirmed in the 6th century, is that God is sovereign and that we are saved by grace and not by individual effort. And so they try to make a place for freedom of the will, and they call it compatibilism. And today many theologians, many philosophers, some Latter-day Saints believe in compatibilism. I don't think it's an idea that deserves to be taken seriously, but that's not a universal opinion. Compatibilism basically is the idea that, well, God is sovereign. We are free only to act according to our nature. And because we're all fallen and depraved, we're only free to sin. And to my mind, that doesn't constitute a reasonable conception of freedom. So I don't think Joseph Smith had much truck with that idea. I think Joseph Smith was what we would call a libertarian free will thinker. I think it's significant that the very, very first hymn that Emma chooses to be the first hymn in the Restoration hymn book is "Know this, that every soul is free." I think it's significant that through this prism we can go back and look at Joseph's account of the atmosphere, the religious atmosphere in upstate New York of his era, and he talks about these very violent contestations between whom? Between the Presbyterians and the Methodists. What's the point of division between the Methodists and the Presbyterians? It's arguments about freedom of the will. You've got the Methodists who are Arminians, arguing place for freedom of the will, Presbyterians who are hardcore Calvinists, no place for freedom of the will. So we know this was very central to his own religious struggles, and it's not a coincidence, of course, that he chooses the Methodist faith until he is instructed otherwise as a result of the first vision. So that division persists to some extent in modern Christendom, although it's not at the foreground, and I think most people just intuitively believe in freedom of the will. And by the way, in this book, I use freedom of the will, freedom, agency interchangeably, because Joseph Smith does, and the Doctrine and Covenants seems to. So let me just give you, because I didn't already give you a quick definition of how I'm understanding freedom of the will. I think the baseline definition for most philosophers today who defend freedom of the will is, it means in simple terms, you could have acted otherwise. So if you act in such a way that upon reflection you think, no, I could have chosen differently, then that's a genuine freedom of the will. I like the argument of Immanuel Kant, the philosopher. I don't think anybody can prove or disprove freedom of the will philosophically, but his argument from intuition is very simple. We feel guilty when we do things we know we shouldn't have done. And he said there's an inherent proof there that we consider ourselves to be free, or we wouldn't feel guilt for not acting in ways that we choose to act. Last topic that I'll treat with just briefly is the idea, and I tried to develop this idea that agency can be better understood as a communal gift and power than as an atomistic, individualized capacity. And I make that argument for a few reasons. One is because all cutting-edge people who work in cutting-edge physics, cosmology, science, are coming increasingly to the recognition that whether you're talking about a rainbow or whether you're talking about an electron, reality only manifests itself in interactions. There is no kind of positive value that we can attribute to anything except in interactions, and I think that's true of human identities as well. I think we only exist relationally, and I think that agency can be understood relationally for this reason. I take one passage of Joseph Smith and I run pretty far with it. But Joseph Smith once said that there wasn't ever an intelligence born into the world that wasn't susceptible of enlargement. And maybe coming from literary criticism, I impute too much meaning to one particular word choice. But he said susceptible enlargement. He didn't say capable. And susceptibility is a capacity to be open, to be receptive, or to be responsive in particular ways. And so I track this theme through the Doctrine and Covenants, and I think it ends up being a common motif in the Doctrine and Covenants, that we have the capacity to choose what we are responsive to, what gifts we will receive, what influences we will allow to predominate in our lives, and we also need to be attentive to the kinds of influences that we exert on one another, because going all the way back to Plato, to be an agent means to have the capacity to act in such a way that we act upon something else. Or to be acted on. And so, again, that requires a community, right? We can't act meaningfully with moral agency in isolation, in an atomized way. We have to be in a community. And I think this is also, of course, fully consistent with the whole Restoration emphasis on salvation as communal. Our project here is one of cooperative salvation and not individualistic aspiration towards salvation. So these are some of the themes. I end, I think, with a brief discussion of agency and atonement. And let me see if I can just say a couple of things. Do I still have a minute or two? Okay. One of the questions, and this is, I think, the great question, especially in the 19th century, philosophers, writers like Byron and Dostoevsky will ask, how is our agency not abrogated if Christ bears the responsibility for our actions? Seems to be a head-on collision of these two principles. And I find a plausible solution in the fact that we never enjoy perfect agency. So though I affirm agency, it's always a compromised agency, right? We are increasingly aware today of the ways in which heredity, genetics, environment, all kinds of conditioning predisposes us to act in certain ways so that we're not as free as we think we are. And that's a good thing, because if we were fully aware, fully moral agents at every moment of our lives, then we would bear an unmitigated, uncompromised responsibility and accountability for every action we perform. But it's because we can't that Christ can effectively say to us, if you want to make that choice again with a fuller understanding of the consequences and implications of what you were choosing, then you can do that, and agency is safeguarded, but those consequences will unfold in a way. That is one possible way of reconciling atonement with our principle of